Since my previous blaster videos made such a big splash, I decided to draft up some streamlined and current versions of them just for the fun of it. These new versions are a breeze to make. My previous blaster videos can be found here, as well as links are in the description. With that, it's time to dive in and get to work. Today I'm going to use these two 5-gallon air tanks in these various brass components to build streamlined versions of my air and water blasters. The previous versions, while they work great, are a bit clunky in the way that I went about building them. There are a few places where I could have used one component instead of using two, and using all brass components will be much better long term. So I improved my previous design to only use these few components to make the air blaster, and these components will make a water blaster. And just like the previous builds, I will be using these 1/2 inch 12-volt single-action solenoid valves. The larger valves will let out a lot of air in one go, which will give a good kick to the burst of air that comes out. I'll start with laying out the parts for the air blaster to make sure that I have everything that I need before I begin assembly. With everything accounted for, I'll start with this 1/2 inch hex nipple and the T-connector. I picked these specific T-connectors, which have 2 female ends and 1 male end, because the way that these parts will go together, it will end up requiring fewer individual components. To ensure that everything has an airtight connection, I'll wrap all of the male ends of these fittings with some Teflon tape. Next, I'll attach the 5/8 hose barb to the side of the solenoid with the arrow pointing out. It was during the previous air blaster video that I discovered that these valves were directional. I haven't tried using them backwards, so I don't know what happens, and for the sake of the space-time continuum, I'm not going to. An oversight from the previous air blaster video was that I didn't include a pressure regulator on the air intake port. So this time around, I'm going to correct that. Just like the air valve, the regulator is directional. That means that the quick connector goes on the side with the L, and the connection to the air tank goes on the side with the arrow. Next, I'm going to attach the solenoid to the T, but to do so, I first need to check how it will be positioned on the air tank. I temporarily thread everything onto the air tank, and when I have it in the position that I like, I mark both the T and the solenoid with a permanent marker. This way, when I'm tightening them together, I'll know that they will line up correctly when I permanently attach them to the air tank. However, before I connect the T to the solenoid, I decided to finish connecting the rest of the components to the T first. The next component that I attach to the T is the 1/2 to 1/4 reducer hex nipple. This reducer steps down the 1/2 pipe thread of the T to the thread size of the emergency valve, the regulator, and the quick connector. Next, I attach the emergency valve. This valve will allow me to disconnect the tank from the compressor without having the entire pressurized contents of the tank being released, unless I want it to. Additionally, if there is ever any issue with the air hose, I can easily cut off the flow of air from the tank. Next, I'm going to attach the solenoid to the T. To make sure that it doesn't accidentally get damaged, I'm going to remove the actual solenoid from the valve. I decided to attach the solenoid to the T before attaching the regulator to the T because I wanted to be able to securely tighten and line up the marks between the two before adding additional components. For the last part of assembling the brass components, I'm going to attach the regulator and quick connect combo onto the emergency valve. I'm going to finally attach it to the air tank. When sourcing parts for this project, I specifically wanted these 1/2 inch hex nipples for the part that threads into the air tank. The reason being is that previously, on my original air blaster, I had to use a 12-inch piece of pipe that was threaded into the solenoid valve to get enough leverage to tighten this portion onto the tank. With this hex nipple, I can simply use a wrench to tighten it from the base as opposed to putting torque on the brass solenoid valve. Additionally, I can attach the mechanism as one complete part as opposed to having to assemble it in sections. To finish the main part of this air blaster, all I have left to do is put the solenoid back on the valve and attach the 5/8 hose onto the hose barb with a hose clamp. Well, looks like Kitty wants to take a look at my progress. Or interrupt me to get some pets. Anywho, I'll take this moment to briefly mention my Patreon. As much as I enjoy making projects and making videos about my projects, it can get a bit much financially. I'd love to work on some bigger and much more elaborate projects and share them with all of you. So if you liked this video or found any of my other projects to be helpful or inspirational, please consider contributing. The link, as always, is in the description. Now to finish this air blaster by attaching the hose to the barb, and I have a little bit left to do as far as wiring goes, but I'll get to that later. Next, I'll move on to assembling the water blaster. Just like with my air blaster, I'll start by laying out all of my parts to make sure that I have everything that I need. With everything accounted for, I'll start by assembling the 1/2 hex nipple and the T. The two T's that I'll be using for this project are the same type of T's that I used from before. They both have 2 female ends and 1 male end. I also decided to use a rag to cover my vise this time around because when assembling the air blaster, a few of the components got a bit scratched up. With those two parts assembled, I'll move on to adding this 1/2 to 1/4 reducer hex nipple. Once I've tightened it into place, I move on to adding the air regulator onto the 1/4 inch side of the reducer nipple, making sure that the directional arrow is pointing in the correct direction. Before I move forward, I check the position of the air regulator in relation to the air tank to make sure that it can be easily accessed when using this water blaster. Looks good, so now I can move forward. Next, I'll attach the emergency shutoff valve and the quick connect connector together. With those two attached together, I can assemble them with the rest of the other components that I've been working on. I assembled the valve and the quick connector together first, because once I get the valve into the position that I need it to be in, I didn't want the tightening of the quick connector to end up moving it out of alignment with the rest of the other components. Here is the back half of the mechanism all assembled. Next, I'm going to attach the solenoid valve to the male end of the T. Just like with the permanent marker marks on the air blaster, I align the solenoid with the air regulator to make sure that everything will fit properly onto the air tank. I also do one more check just to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes before adding any more components. Everything looks good. Now I'm going to attach the 1/2 to 5/8 hose barb to one of the female ends of the second T. With those two components securely attached together, I'm going to attach the second 1/2 to 1/4 reducer hex nipple to the other female end of the T. After some quick checks, I'm going to temporarily thread the T and solenoid together. Basically, the reason that I'm going to assemble the brass components together first and then try to attach the solenoid for the water is because otherwise I wouldn't be able to get it threaded because it would be too close to the larger solenoid, which would prevent it from spinning. To attach the smaller solenoid, I first have to attach it to the brass elbow connector, and then it can spin freely around the 1/4 inch side of the reducer nipple. But to do all of this, and to get everything to line up correctly, I have to do some test fittings, mark things with markers, and then do the final assembly. I'll then make some marks on both parts so that I can make sure that everything will clear the handle on the air tank when I'm doing the final assembly. With the alignments checked and the marks made, I'm going to permanently attach the male end of the second T into the other side of the large solenoid valve. Now that the second T is securely tightened into place, I can move on to assembling the small solenoid, the elbow, an emergency shutoff valve, and the 5/8 hose barb. Just like with the previous emergency valve, I assemble the hose barb and valve together first. Again, to make sure that everything was aligned properly, if I had went with attaching the emergency valve to the solenoid first, when it came to putting torque on tightening the hose barb, I might have pushed the emergency valve out of alignment with the solenoid. With the solenoid, emergency valve, and hose barb assembled, I can move on to attaching the elbow on the other side of the solenoid. I have to make sure that I get these two parts aligned correctly, otherwise the small solenoid might still hit the larger solenoid, or they might not be lined up parallel to one another. Compared to the complicated mess that was the assembly of the original air blaster and water blaster, I feel that I made these two much less confusing to put together. Here is the mechanism with all of the main components put together. And now it's time to get this air tank recoated with a nice shade of blue. Oh my goodness, look at that, it's just like magic. I snap my fingers and it's a different color. Totally not a simple editing trick. What? How? It's magical! With the magic and childlike wonderment out of the way, it's time to attach the water blaster mechanism to the air tank. The same as the air blaster, instead of putting any torque on the brass components of the mechanism, I use a wrench on the hex portion of the hex nipple at the base. With the water blaster assembled, Kitty decided to interrupt me again to get some more pets. I swear she is an affectionate black hole. She's supposed to be a tough outdoor kitty, but she's just always dying for more head scritches. Back to the water blaster. All I have left to do is attach the hose for the water, the hose for the business end, and a little bit of wiring. For the water hose, I attach a standard female garden hose end to one side of this short bit of tube, and then secure to the hose barb that is attached to the small solenoid. I then attach a longer 4-foot piece of tube to the hose barb that is attached to the large solenoid. And with that, both the main part of the air blaster and water blasters are done. Now, it's time to wire up some water-resistant connectors to the solenoids. I found these little connectors online, and I picked them because they were advertised as being water-resistant. Since the haunted attractions that I do are usually outside and at the mercy of the elements, I'm always looking for ways to keep things from getting ruined by moisture. These connectors are actually fairly simple to install. After first having to attach some wires to the solenoid, I just have to strip the ends of the wires, thread one of these little yellow silicone bushings onto the wire, crimp the tabs around the yellow bushing to hold it into place, crimp the metal connector onto the exposed ends of the wire, and press it into the plastic connector end. There is actually one more little red piece of plastic that snaps onto the end of the connector, but unfortunately I forgot to add them when recording this. I did remember to add them for the reveal at the end of the video. With the air blaster wired up with its connectors, it's time to move on to adding the same connectors to both of the solenoids on the water blaster. Unlike in my previous air and water blaster videos, I won't be going into any further depth about wiring up any switches or triggers for these, since I already showed my process for doing that in those previous videos. If that's of any interest, the links for those videos are in the description. I wanted to take this moment to say that compressed air, as well as air blasters and water blasters, can be dangerous or even deadly. I do not condone any use outside the scope of being used for an effect for a haunted house. Additionally, I never position either blaster to point at anyone's face or vital organs. Please use safely and with good judgment. Thank you. Since it's just about that time, I'll catch up with everyone in a few moments for the reveal. And there they are. I like them so much. They're such a huge improvement over the original ones that I made. The old ones have their merits. They're made with basic components that were found at my local hardware store, so I feel that it makes it a low barrier to entry and accessible effect for anyone to add to their haunted house. Additionally, if anyone would like to have me make one of these for you, please feel free to reach out. Operators are standing by. Lastly, for those of you who skipped the entire video to watch the reveal at the end, if you liked this video or found it helpful, please consider supporting my Patreon so that I can continue to make more awesome projects like these. And now, some clips of these blasters in action. Ow. At 100 plus PSI inside my shop, that was actually really loud and hurt my ears a bit. I'll try that again with a lower PSI. Much better. So I'll give you a signal to go. I didn't mean now. Would you wait? And with that, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.